Okay, for people who are joining this live stream, we are talking about language completeness and consistency for Wolfram Language, and we have a variety of things on our agenda today. All right, first one, storage location. I don't know what that is, but we're about to find out.
Right. So this is the issue of we have various things like, audio capture and speech synthesize that want to create files, sort of semi-anonymous files on the disk.
Yes.
And, where should they go? And sort of, that this other notebook is sort of our longer discussion notebook from the dedicated meeting in case we need it. But I've sort of summarized my recommendation and my reasoning in the agenda there. Which is, and basically the two final candidates are basically either putting things in user documents directory as some functions have already been doing, or to use local objects. And I think using user documents directory is the better route. And if you open up the little sections there, you'll sort of see the reasoning. But the basic reason is that files in user document directories are sort of, you can find them, they're actual files. So if you want to use them for anything outside of the language, they're very easy to use. Whereas local objects, they sort of look like files, but they're not really files. They're directories with different files in them, and they're in a hidden portion of the file system. So they're sort of much less easy to use.
I personally am not a big fan of people being able to take all this stuff that we're not thinking very carefully about, that's really just cache files, and exposing them. I mean, I'd much prefer to see them in local objects with perhaps some utility functions that allow you to manage those local objects and things like that in a controlled way, rather than making people think they know what they are and then getting confused and they delete one and then things go bonkers and they say, oh, it's all messed up.
Or I don't understand that statement. I mean, if you audio, right, these aren't really cache files. I mean, if you do audio capture, you are recording something.
Okay.
And that needs to be recorded somewhere.
Okay, but so in the cloud, we'll do the same thing, and these will be anonymous cloud objects, correct?
I don't know. Nobody. Well, I don't know how you could do audio capture in the cloud.
Well, you can. You can do audio capture in the cloud. Do we need people from the cloud team here? Because I think that it will just work to go. I think it will turn into a cloud object. I mean, I can try doing it right now.
Sure.
Let's see. Oh, for goodness sake, it has lost my login again. This is really broken. It should not be asking me to sign in again. Okay, let's try it. Oh, it's not working. I thought this was working. Well, okay, so I can't test it. But whatever it does in the cloud, I think it's saving into cloud objects. Now, right. Arguably, even in the cloud, it should be saving into some kind of subdirectory in the cloud of cloud objects, or somehow they should be indicated, because if it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, there's some kind of UUID objects, basically. Okay, who else here is involved in this question? Because I mean, do we actually have the right set of people here?
Yes, I mean we have. We have Shadi, we have Roman. I think those were sort of the main. We have John and Ian who.
Okay, and Nick also. Is Nick here?
Nick, yes, he's here.
Yeah.
Okay, so your cache files, right? The entity store cache files. Those are in the local object store. Is that correct?
They're not in the local object store at the moment.
Well, where are they?
They're
in $user-base directory, right?
Oh.
Yeah. I mean, the cache file system predates local object store, and we didn't migrate over because we wanted to have initial compatibility, and there wasn't a big
right.
And
But
where
I
is the
think,
local object
but
store?
Stephen, I think you are confusing two different issues. I mean, these are not cache fails, right? These are things we don't want to automatically disappear. You know,
I understand. There are two categories here: ones that are actually storing real data, and ones which are okay, so that's the location of the local object store. Is that right? Library / whatever / object / UUID.
right.
Okay. So, I mean, there are two categories of things. I think there are cache files, and there are somehow permanent files. Those are two types of things. Files that contain real data that you now. Is there anything? Are there any gray areas there? Do you understand what I'm asking? I mean, so in other words, they're files which, if you were to blow them away, they will always be recoverable from the cloud. Now, I would say that the persistent object system is another way to recover, if you understand what I'm saying, right? So one way to recover is they're just public, it's public entity store data that is being cached locally by a particular user, but it's always recoverable from the global knowledge base, right? Another case is it's a local cache of something which you are storing in the cloud, for example, and which can be refreshed from the cloud. Does that make sense? Roman, can you speak to that, please? Roman, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I mean, one thing that I think we need to keep apart is when you work entirely in the cloud. I mean, you still have two different sets of areas. You have your home directory and you have cloud objects, and they just happen to be on the same machine when you work on the cloud. But
well, we're trying to get rid of stuff that's home directory related. I mean,
okay.
In principle, confusingly enough, one could have a local object store in the cloud, couldn't one?
Yeah, I mean, that's perfectly supported, and it's just as local as is the local object store on your desktop. So if you want to exchange files, then you should always use the cloud location, because that is then accessible from anywhere, from the cloud itself and from your desktop.
All right, but so I have to say, I believe that we should be using, for these persistent files, we should be using the local object store. For the cache files, it's less clear to me what we should be using. Okay, so Itai, you obviously don't agree with this. So what is your point of view?
So, right. So the file, right, my audio captures or whatever, if I want, to email them or import them into, my iMovie project or whatever, if they're in user documents directory, I can just, open the file and stick it in there. If they're
okay, let's get some other examples. So audio is one example. Shadi, can you speak about other examples? I mean, in other words, are they going to be file extensions like MP3 or JPEG or whatever that anybody else understands, or are they our, private file extensions?
We have on the list of functions, we also have out-of-core image operations like image file apply, image file filter.
I understand, but those will have JPEGs and things, won't they?
Exactly. Right.
Okay, but so what
we're talking about JPEGs, we're talking about WAV files or MP3s, we're talking about in the future.
Okay, what about dataset? What's dataset going to do? Because it's got an out of core mechanism as well. And what are notebooks going to do when they have out of core mechanisms? You understand my question? I mean, so I get your point, and it's not a bad point, that if they are standard file extensions, then you can potentially pick them up and do things with them, although their names are UUIDs, aren't they?
Typically, unless explicitly specified.
How would you specify them?
Like audio capture can take a file path, and then you can say explicitly, you can explicitly
how does that
specify.
relate to the target location option?
Right. So I mean, there are sort of two things you might want to do. You might want to name give a special name, and but keep it in sort of the default directory. or you might want to, specify a sort of target directory and,
Yes, I understand.
And have anonymous objects in there. And I mean, this option doesn't exist yet, and in fact, it's not even designed, which is why I said possible future options in the agenda. But that's sort of where that separating the
Okay, I get it. I understand.
Right.
I understand.
Let me ask another question. Is it basically intended that this is only going to work well when kernel and front end are running on the same file system? I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I'm trying to figure out how things work if they're on different file systems, and it seems challenged.
Seems wrong to me.
Well, I think these are always, everything in this notebook is referring to the kernel's file system.
No, it isn't.
Yes,
Audio
it is.
capture isn't. Audio capture is happening in the front end.
No, it's
Or
not.
maybe it's streaming stuff to the kernel file system.
The audio capture doesn't happen in the front end. There's a little interface.
Well, yeah, the audio capture. Yeah, what Stephen means, which is not quite the same thing, is that audio capture is it's through a user interface that's happening on your system. But does that user can you even instantiate such a user interface with the remote kernel? Unless Shadi's team is doing some really interesting stuff, I'll bet the answer is no.
Well, what is the answer, Shadi?
We also have a no GUI version of audio capture. We just get the samples from audio device and save it in the file.
Yeah, but can you get it from a device on another system, like the system the front end is running on?
Right. So
no,
you need to check that. Well, okay, so that relates to this client value mechanism that we really need to get, which is this way of being able to request something from a remote client that has a sensor of some kind on it. Okay, let's loop back again. So one thing I need to see is a list of all of the different things that we are trying to store, okay, which I don't see here. Right? So the things that I'm aware of are audio objects.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't we have a listy tie in that other target location notebook?
Well, I think there's a list of the main things in the agenda, but
look at existing behavior, Stephen.
Well, no, because I think
don't.
I think that's confusing way too many different things.
Oh, wait a second. Writes the working directory. URL download saves files in temporary directory. Does it clean them up?
Well, the OS will do that for you. That's
if it's in the temporary directory.
Yes.
Cache-based directory. So is that the same place that is $cache-based directory the same place that next stuff saves to?
No.
Okay.
Although it arguably should, given that we have something called cache-based directory.
I wasn't even aware this existed.
I guess it was, or is this a cache of local objects and not a cache of files?
No. It's a cache of anything. It's a cache of what you get when you, for example, local cache of a URL.
But look what it's creating. It's creating local objects. It's not creating files.
Yes, local cache is that particular function that triggered the creation of that cache-based directory. But the idea has always been that other caching mechanisms could use it too, so we have all the caches in one place, which makes it easy to wipe them if they're no longer needed.
Okay, so where is the local object-based directory?
$local base.
Yeah.
Now, this depends on the operating system. Now, apparently on the Mac, there is a dedicated caches directory, and on other ones, we have other
every
conventions.
platform has some notion of a cache.
Yes, I mean, it's a fairly standard place where these things are supposed to be.
Right, and the things that go on cache in the cache directory are precisely those things which, if they're blown away, nothing is lost because they're really just caches. I mean, as far as the operating system is concerned, that's sort of a bright line rule.
Sorry, I spaced out for a second. Could you say that again, please?
So tilde library caches, by definition, is supposed to store exactly files that if you blow them away, nothing is lost because they're caches.
Look at this. This is crazy. We got to decide: is it library Wolfram or is it, I mean, this isn't. This
no. That is the OS standard location.
Okay.
And on Linux it would be .wolfram cache. No, it would be I forget what it is on Linux. And Windows has some other crazy, app data caches, whatever.
I had a question about $user documents directory, especially given the idea that we should stick things there so that they're accessible. Should it be a cloud object in the cloud instead of just a path?
Possibly. What is it in the cloud? Is it?
I see it as /Wolfram Cloud /user file / unique stuff to the user, not a cloud object.
Right, but can't you do things in the cloud with that file path?
Not properly, because if you do stuff, if you access and particularly create, maybe that's not what we're talking. Well, we are kind of talking about that. If you create files in the cloud just using the path and not as a cloud object, then it's not visible in the GUI file system and that sort of thing.
Oh, that's an interesting question that perhaps we should bring up to cloud folk.
Well, that is being discussed, right? I think there are plans to make that file system visible and manageable through the cloud interface.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so listen. What's happened with the cloud? Let me show you something. I mean, so right now, we have this craziness where we have the published directory as one of the directories in the home directory. That is changing. The home directory is going to be at the same level and published, and the other special directories are going to be at a higher level. And so we certainly have the opportunity there to put some things. You get what I'm saying? Right. So, look, first of all, I think this is going to need another meeting, because I think we need a better list of what all the objects are. Who is project managing this particular thing?
It's me, Devin.
Okay, so you need to go find out what you need to go inventory what all of these different things are. So the ones that I didn't even remember about URL download. Okay. Gosh, there's a lot of stuff here.
Which I think is mixing several different classes of objects.
I understand that. I understand that. They're ones that we want to be temporary. Okay, so let's understand what categories of things we want. Okay, we want things that go to the temp directory, things going to temp, basically. Okay, things that are cached, they could be blown away, but you don't want them to be blown away on reboot.
Yep.
Right? Like Nick's stuff. Okay. Then we want I'm going to take another category: things that are really internal to the system, but permanent. Okay. So of those, I'm imagining, that there are plenty of. There's a bunch of local object stuff that is in that category.
Right, and all obviously, most of the things that are in dollar user base directory are in that category, like your kernel init.m and your front end init.m.
No, but those are not internal to the system. Internal to the system. So that means the user is not expected to understand them, right?
I see.
The user might not understand them.
I see.
Okay. Things that are user understandable, user modifiable potentially, but permanent, right? Things that are externally user modifiable. So here, not externally user modifiable, right?
Right. And I don't know that this is a distinct category from these a disjoint category from these four categories, but you have also cases where you are manipulating things rather than one at a time, but in groups, right? And so that has
What's an example?
Like image file apply, filter apply. I forget.
Shadi, can you say, please?
Image file apply and file filter, but I think that goes into that category that are externally user modifiable.
Right, although just sort of the defaults and the controls you want might be slightly different, right? Because you might want to say, each new file should have this appended to the name, right? You take the source file and you add this to the name, and then you put in the extension, right? It's not right. It's not necessarily a difference in how we where we locate them broadly.
Hey, listen, Devin, for your purposes, please note where I'm putting this.
Sure.
Okay. Persistence and initialization file locations.
And we also have an additional dimension, and that is the visibility. Like, is it local or is it a cloud thing?
Right. So this is case one. So this is, what is it? What is it? And then there's where is it? And that's basically local. And then, well, there's local, there's cloud, there's local / local FE/kernel, right?
And notebook.
Local / okay, so that's a different thing. That's a different issue. Okay, so remote kernel, right? Okay, so another question is, where will it be used, right? What is it associated with? Okay, so one possibility is kernel. Another possibility is notebook. Now that's a tricky case because, for example, for the, that relates to John's stuff about remote assets for notebooks, right? And in fact, when it's associated with a notebook, I strongly think it should be in a local object or a cloud object.
Well,
I would strongly disagree with that because
it has to be that way.
It has to, but if I want to send a notebook and it's in my local objects,
right, it won't work. It won't work.
Right. So why don't we want it next to the notebook so I know to send both
Can't
of
be
them?
done. No, we're not going to do that. That's a mistake. If we're going to do this, we should do it with some persistence location where, when you say you're going to send the notebook, it tells you, just like we're doing with the audio objects, do you want to store it locally?
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
But there is such a persistence location that stores its data right inside the notebook, so it's always there.
Okay. All right. Go on, John. You were going to say.
Yeah.
Something.
So if we had compound notebooks, is anyone going to argue that it shouldn't be inside the notebook file proper?
Well, I would say the compound notebooks are directories, aren't they?
Well, we haven't really spec'd them out yet, and there are some interesting questions which merit raising. But yes, the notion is that the notebook essentially has a mini file system attached to it.
Right. Well, I'm not sure about that. I mean, there's the horror of moving around HTML bundles that doesn't work very well.
Right,
for
but
example, just like a zip file, right? The zip file is a single file, but
no, I know, but you don't want a single file because you've got 100 megabyte, some weird 100 megabyte data set. You do not, every time you do something with open the notebook, for example, you don't want to be schlepping 100 megabytes of gunk around. Right, so it really should be a separate file that is.
Well, I mean, if it seems to me the question is, how much do you want the information in the notebook? I mean, if you want it in the notebook, surely you do want to schlep a 100 megabyte thing around.
Right, but that's exactly what we're dealing with here. Okay, that's exactly the freedom that we have here. This is asking you, do you want to store it in the notebook or not? Right. So when you send the notebook, you might want to send that along, or you might not.
is it? I mean, I'm not sure I've ever seen whatever prompt it is, or
well, you
or
should
what you think in the interface,
right? I mean,
Stephen, on a modern computer, if you double click on a gigabyte zip file and then double click on one of its members, it opens instantly. There's absolutely no overhead with the.
So what? I mean, so. I don't understand what you're saying there.
Well, that it can be a single file, but to all intents and purposes, it behaves like a directory that just automatically opens when needed. But because it's a single file, it's much easier to keep coherent.
Okay. Well, that's the future proposal for notebooks.
right?
Is that the idea?
And I mean, I don't know that we actually want for compound notebooks to be directories, but Apple doesn't seem to have had problem making Keynote files or iMovie files or anything directories.
Well, they control the operating system as well, which kind of helps. Right, yes. But John, what is the timescale for compound notebooks?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. It depends on the priorities of things. What we could do, on a much shorter time frame is we could spec out in some detail what it would actually be and come to an agreement on that. And once we come to an agreement on that, we can probably, say better how long it would take to implement it.
All right, fine. But if that's the case, then what that is implying is that in the future, these storage locations, for example, for audio capture, would actually be in the notebook bundle.
Well, so there are some tricky things around this.
I would say that would be a possible location. I mean, right?
I think it's the best location because then they would can move.
Well, it depends on what you want to do with it, right? If I'm using audio capture to I mean, maybe you're going to fire me for this, but if I'm using audio capture to create a birthday movie for my mother, I might do some of my audio processing in Mathematica, but I'm not going to be sending her a notebook, right? I'm going to be sending her some MP4 or something that she can just click and watch.
Then export it.
Then export it, yeah.
Use export.
Just like anything else.
Don't go digging around. Just because you know how to hack file systems doesn't mean we should ask our users to hack file systems.
Right.
Well, but I mean, you could also argue that you are just using the front end to enter kernel commands. And so there's no way you would want the output to somehow end up in the notebook. It would end up in your file system.
Well, that's a good question. So kernel, another one is a raw kernel.
Right.
E.g. Wolfram Engine.
Right. So that obviously can't store it in the notebook, not in any sort of useful way.
Well, and also it's difficult to imagine something that that writes out things to the notebook in real time, because then you have this weird situation of a notebook that's in a half saved, half unsaved state. I mean, for reading, you could do that. You could read directly from the file, but for writing, I've been thinking about this, and I think what you want to do is you want to redirect things through temporary files, which then when you hit Control S or Command S, whatever the state of those temporary files then gets saved back into your notebook.
Okay, look. We're things like the raw kernel case strongly suggest that they are external files not bundled up with the notebook. And that perhaps what we should try to do, now I admit, if you pick up the notebook in your Finder and move it somewhere, it's never going to work unless, well, it could work on your local file system because it refers to a local object with a UUID, right? But if you send it to somebody, if you drag it into, okay, let's be realistic. You're not going to be able to drag it into your email, for example, if it's really big, right? So the question is, so our exporting mechanisms could ask you, do you want to bundle it? Do you want to create the zip file that bundles the notebook with its assets or not? Am I making sense?
Well, in terms of the email problem, of course, that's a thing that we've already solved.
What's already? What do you mean it's already?
If your notebook is larger than, I think it's 10 megabytes, then we automatically basically have you go through, assuming you've logged into the cloud, have you go through the save it to the cloud and send out a link.
Right, if you're using the send mail menu item rather than your own mail client.
Right. Yeah. So if people are going in raw, then they're going to have a hard time. I mean, it's not going to work perfectly. And I think we just have to assume that when we're managing large files and large amounts of data, that going in raw might fail.
Well, but this isn't, I mean, people are already making large notebooks, though. I mean, this doesn't...
No, I understand. I'm talking about notebooks that have backing data, gigabyte-sized backing data, okay? Like large audio files, videos, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, there are several ways, several useful ways these could be saved. You could say, I want everything packaged together in a zip file. I want the data to be uploaded to the cloud and only ship a link. Or I want to upload it to a cloud file service and just send the links. I mean, there are several ways to do it.
That's an interesting. That last one you just mentioned is a persistence location that we should potentially add as soon as we have external storage, right? We could add as a persistence location, storing it in S3 or Dropbox or something. Does that make sense, Roman?
Yes, that's a good point. Sorry, I was on mute.
Yeah. Okay, but so what we're saying then is, okay, let's unroll this for a second. Okay, you're going to have some large asset. You are going to reference it in the notebook, but it should be stored somewhere, and it could be in your local file system, it could be in the cloud, it could be in a variety of places. If it's in the cloud, it's probably going to cache locally, but conceptually, it's stored somewhere. Now, some of that conceptual storage is not transferable to anybody else. Am I making sense?
Sure.
Okay, so now the question is, what do we do if it was stored locally for your convenience, but it does not have a backing in the cloud or any other public place, right? What do we do? So the answer is, if you send somebody the notebook, they're not going to be able to get the additional assets unless they are somehow, at the time when the notebook is being packaged up to be sent.
Right, and I would certainly be for having some mechanism whereby you can easily add up these extra resources. But I would like to point out that that's a sort of a different problem than the one where we started this conversation, which is I just want to, record a bunch of things or speech synthesize a bunch of things.
I know. But let's do the notebook case first, okay? So in the toolbar that hopefully we're going to start seeing for 12.1 soon, John, right? John.
Yeah.
The what for?
The toolbar. Every notebook is going to have a toolbar.
Yeah.
So among the things that we could put in there, possibly, is something as an indicator that says this notebook has non-local assets. Okay? Said more clearly than that. In other words, it's the analog of the little thing here that indicates that it is not stored locally at this point in the notebook. See what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So you could, once we do that, you could always click on that and say, no, I want to store these assets locally in the notebook, or at least it gives you an indication. You click that thing and it could say, make me a notebook bundle, or give me these different options for how I can send my notebook to somebody else and have them get those assets.
I mean, just granted, I haven't not thought about this deeply, but my initial reaction is we would just want a button which says create a zip file with all my resources.
No, that's not right. You don't necessarily want that. You do not want that. You might want to say, publish this to the cloud, put this in S3, right? So that other people can collect it. Even share with these specific people, because let's say you're going to send this to 10 people, right? You really don't want to be, or you might not want every one of them to have that ½ gigabyte of stuff sent to them and put in their email. By the way, the zip file may not be the right thing. It may very well not be the right thing, because email, it may be too big for email. It may be blah, 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 lots of different issues. So I think that is one option, but I don't think by any means it's the obvious option for people.
Well, and we should be careful about focusing too much on the email case. I mean, it's already the case that email is considered far too limiting for this kind of thing by many people. That's why we have Dropbox and Google Drive and OneDrive and etc.
Okay, so how will things be transferred? Email is one. Another is, Dropbox-like things, of which, S3 and things like that, I suppose we could consider similar. And another is, our cloud. Right? Or private clouds.
And I might add GitHub and GitHub-like things.
Yeah, okay.
Right. Although, yeah, I mean, except until such time as we have an actual compound notebook, I'm not sure how this button will go through and find the alleged resources, and how we would even define that.
No, it's easy. It's things that there'll be things like this, okay? We know where those are in the notebook. It's like, we could even imagine an iconize thing where there is an iconize where the iconize is a non-local iconize.
One thing we have discussed for these out of core audio objects is to make these assets available on the cloud and just make the notebook small enough so that it can
I know. That's what we're just
access.
talking about, Shadi. That's what we're just talking about, okay?
But I think that's a combination of your how to transfer. It's an email plus cloud.
I know, that's the point. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. Yeah, right. So, I mean, sorry. So how will the notebook be transferred?
Yep.
Right, because the underlying assets will be transferred in other ways. In fact, you can mix and match these things if you want to.
Exactly. Yep.
Would that be a resource function then afterwards? Or I guess the next section would be like information on the above.
What do you mean?
Well, I guess like workflows on how to do all the stuff.
Yeah.
Above.
That's far downstream.
Okay.
Right. I mean right. So somebody's asking on the live stream about a share with button. Yeah, of course, in the cloud we absolutely have that, and we have share with through our cloud. We absolutely have that mechanism. The issue is things that you're working with on the desktop. As soon as you're prepared to use our share with button to send, content, it's all going to work. It's easy for us to make that work. The issue is if you want to itai it and you're going to do file hacking and you want to pick up the raw files and send them, then you could get yourself quite tangled. And the question is, how much do we want to help you to not get tangled? Am I making sense? Is that a fair summary?
I don't think that's an entirely fair summary, right? Because the cloud notebook only, right, doesn't reference anything on your local machine, or if it does, it's broken broken even for you. Whereas here, the problem is that it's very easy to create notebooks which are not self-contained.
No, I understand that. I'm saying if you're working locally, right? You're using notebooks, you're just using the raw engine, whatever. If you're working locally, there may be tons of ancillary files that you're dealing with, which are local to your machine, okay? But then suddenly you say, well, actually, I want to send my work to somebody else, right? And the notebook that you have references those local files, but if you simply drag that notebook to your email, it will not pick up those local files. It will merely have a reference to a local file that doesn't exist for the recipient, right? So the problem is, if you use our share with button, for example, then our share with button can absolutely go through the notebook and say, oh, this is referencing a local file. You probably want to send that as well. And it can say how to, it can give you 3 options for how to do that and so on, right? That's all straightforward. The problem is if you file hack it and you simply take the notebook file and drag it into your email, then it isn't going to work. People following me?
Well, I don't think the share with button is as simple to implement as you think, or nor do I.
We've already implemented it. We've already implemented it for. Look, the question of how we can.
No, we haven't. Where have we implemented it?
Okay, okay. These things where we have remote reference to things in files. I admit we haven't implemented it. It reminds me of save definitions. I'm quite certain we can implement it. I mean, we have to be able to find all the places. So for example, it is the case. We have to decide this is a thing on its face referenced in the notebook, right? It is not the case in the notebook. If the notebook references X, but in that kernel session, X was equal to 7,000, okay? Now we go send that notebook to somebody else. Well, by golly, their definition of X will not be carried over, right?
Right.
The issue is things which on their face appear to be in the notebook, but somehow don't get carried over with the notebook.
Right. But you're right. They're right. I mean, maybe this isn't a useful line of discussion, but right, even that's not simple, right? Because suppose there's get package name, right? The front end doesn't know how the kernel will resolve that get. So that's, for example, would be a difficult problem to solve.
Right, because it doesn't know which file system you're talking about.
Among other things.
Right. So I mean, the kernel.
Yes, I just don't think that
Okay, so
I don't consider dragging a notebook to a mail program file hacking. Maybe I'm just offended by your description.
Okay, but the point is the kernel state is not going to be preserved by that, right?
Right. So certainly if you have get of the variable file, that's never going. Well, we could maybe try to hack something up, but right, in principle, that's never going to work. And I think we agree on that.
Ali on our live stream is very keen to know what the toolbar is going to look like. John, do you have a mock-up of it so we could just flash it up?
No.
Okay. Anybody have it?
That's why I have Parth around, but he's not in this meeting.
Is Billy here? Does he have a mock-up of it? I don't know. He's working on it.
I am, but no, sorry.
Okay. Well, it's going to be a very simple, thin toolbar, which is going to have formatting stuff and a bunch of other things that are useful tools to use with notebooks, plus a bunch of state information about the notebook that we really want people to have. It will be very lightweight. Okay. In any case, we're not going ribboned. We're not ribboning. Okay. Probably a good model is what's in the function repository submission notebook. Okay, but back to this. Okay, so kernel state is not going to be transferred. Whatever happens, kernel state is not getting transferred, nor is necessarily the knowledge of. So the thing that we want, my claim is the case of concern is the case where you have something like this, where you might reasonably think that it is, quotes, part of the notebook. Or, for example, one thing that's always messing me up and we need to fix is data sets that are big and are not stored in the notebook. And in fact, they say now, this isn't completely stored in the notebook because you don't want it completely stored in the notebook. You're using the notebook as a viewer onto something which is operating in the kernel. Okay, so the issue is things that on their face appear to be in the notebook but actually have backing files. How do those get to be transferred? And my claim is that so long as we can give people a global signal that there's stuff that involves backing files in the notebook, that, if they drag the notebook into an email thing, then, and they didn't notice that the toolbar said that, well, tough luck. We can't really help that, but we can make it so that it's very easy for them to, get those assets to be transferable, either by putting them in a global cloud or by bundling them up in a zip file or whatever else. And I think that's the approach we should take. But I think that what we need to now think about is for those local files, right? For the files which would be bundled up, where are those files? I don't think at some level it matters that much in the following sense, okay? I think the notebook will be able to find those files. Now, there is a question if, for example, I have Dropbox, right? So some of my file system is in Dropbox, some isn't. It would be of relevance to me to know whether my local cache file, so here's a good question, actually. Let's imagine that my local cache files are in my Dropboxed files, okay? And I open up again on a remote computer. The question is, are those cache files, so let's say, for example, I have entity store caches. Would I, by virtue of Dropbox transferring, now have entity caches on my, second computer, or would those entity caches be invalid for that second computer? Comments from people on that. Now, this is why I would argue that local objects are a good thing, because what we could do, in fact, this is a nice feature, because local objects are based on UUIDs, what would happen is you transfer it through Dropbox to your secondary computer. The thing is there in your local object store, and when you open up the notebook on your secondary computer, there it is with something where it's in your local object store, it's got a UUID, there's a guarantee, the UUID guarantee that there'll never be a collision.
Right, but Dropbox by default shares something in your documents directory, and certainly if you just dropped it, right, if you had the same username on both machines, right, then the path would be the same if you saved it in your Dropbox folder, and it would work just as well. So I don't think...
But Dropbox can share anything. I just think here's the point about this. The point about this is, let's say you're working in two different Wolfram desktops on two different machines, okay? And spraying out cache files, right? This is the important case, right? They both spray out cache files associated with some entities you're getting from the cloud or whatever else, okay? If those cache files, so there are two possibilities. Either those cache files are canonically named so that the same cache of earthquakes or something is named the same way on both machines, or they both have UUIDs and they wouldn't be, it'll be a bit redundant, but at least they won't collide. So Nick, maybe you can say what actually happens with those cache.
Yeah, right now there's a canonical naming scheme so that.
Okay, fine. So okay. All right, well, that's perhaps better.
Which means you can obliterate your cache by using both machines at the same time, right?
Well,
Sure. If they're both writing to the same location, absolutely.
I mean, there are concurrency checks to make sure that we're not reading and writing from the same file at the same time. And if they're both using the same cache location, it'll allow simultaneous reading, but it won't allow reading while writing.
Okay.
And that
what are we doing with file locks for the local file system? I mean, we've got a lot of work going on now for locks in the cloud file, cloud object locks. Do we have similar locks for local files? Seems to me we should have those. And we should probably, Devin, maybe you can follow up on this. Joel is working on the locking for the cloud. Okay.
Yep.
So I think it should be discussed, and I'm not quite sure who with. Maybe Itai would be a good person. Whether we can use similar language structure to specify locking in the local file system. Does that make sense to people?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be good to have a central framework. The entity store has its own mechanism because we didn't have one to fall back on.
Right. So, Devin, you should make Joel aware of that, and then get him to meet with Itai. I think Itai, are you the right person for this?
Sure.
I mean, I'd be interested in being there as well.
Okay.
I mean, we might want this to be part of our next target location meeting. So we just have all of these issues which were raised discussed simultaneously.
Okay, but so rolling back the issue that we're talking about here. Okay, so what we're saying is the main issue is, should things that are cached be in local object store, or should they be in some kind of
Well, I don't think I don't think that is a question worth discussing, because the point of a cache is that it's invisible. A good cache is invisible, so we don't care where it's stored.
Well, we need to know, because if you find out you have a gigabyte-sized cache, and you say, I don't want to use up a 100 gigabyte cache, I don't want to use up 100 gigabytes, you kind of got to know where to find it.
Fine. So we have some mechanism of querying that, but All
right. So let's talk about things that are not externally user modifiable. Okay. So there are things like these JPEGs and your famous MP3 and so on that would be in principle externally user modifiable, but they're permanent. So what things do we have that are not external user modifiable?
I think pretty much everything in the Packlet system.
Okay.
And goes in
user-based Packlets directory, I think.
Which is inside of $user-base directory.
Yeah.
Okay, so what you're telling me right now is that we have, okay, so we've got where is user-base directory in your list of things here? So you're saying user documents directory is not user-base directory.
Right, well, because I think it might have been in my original list, but it's not.
That's frigging weird. User-base directory has the name of the product in it.
Of course it does. It has for 30 years. User-base directory is the oldest of these variables. I mean, okay. Right? This is what.
Well, maybe it's getting long in the tooth. Okay.
But it's also useful if you want to have different settings for your different products.
Right, but I don't think that's the right place. I mean, the fact that Packlets are stored there is probably the reason that I've had all this trouble with different Packlets. Well, okay, that's a different question, whether different versions of the same thing should store in the same directory or not.
And we do have, Wolfram Alpha Notebook Edition introduces a product-specific Packlet. So in that sense, right, it has its own version of the Wolfram Alpha Packlet. I don't think that's a very common case, but I can certainly imagine product-specific Packlets. But that's a separate question. I agree I think Todd just sort of stuck it somewhere when he was creating the Packlet system, and nobody really ever gave it much thought because we never documented the Packlet system, and it's certainly something we could reconsider. But yes, we have obviously $base directory, which will be /library product name. We have obviously that's not for user files. We have user documents directory, which is sort of the default save location for notebooks when you haven't.
Yeah, I think that's irrelevant to this list, in my opinion.
Well, it's where audio capture and things have been used.
I know. I think it's a horrible mistake. I think it's a documents directory. I don't think it's a directory for backing store.
But these aren't backing stores. These are documents.
They're not.
Yeah,
it's a MP3.
Sure. And MP3 is a form of a document. It's not a backing store. It's something I copy onto my iPod to listen to back when I still actually used my iPod. Right.
Okay. All right. So let's just again. You say there's user documents directory.
Mm-hmm.
And what else is there? There's $local
base. There's $cache base directory.
Any other things in this merry band?
But the cache base directory belongs into the cached category and not the permanent one.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess that doesn't really belong in this grouping, but
things that are cached and can be recached. So this is now the temporary directory.
Yep.
Okay, so we do have things that are not external user modifiable that we want to store places. Okay.
There's also cloud base, right? Which is also some kind of permanent non-user modifiable stuff.
Well, although
I mean the whole cloud objects. And indeed, all persistent objects are in
right. So the real question, let's boil this down again. A random JPEG that is the back. So for example, dataset. I don't think dataset has user understandable backing. Does anybody know? I don't think the file that dataset has in the back end is. I think it's like an MX file or something. It's not user modifiable.
I've never seen a dataset that is not in memory, so I don't know.
Okay, well, it's certainly coming that it has backing stuff. Okay, so certain things have backing that is user modifiable, and some other things have backing that isn't user modifiable. Is that a true statement? I mean, I'm pretty sure that's going to be a true statement.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think the distinction between user modifiable and not user modifiable is kind of weird. I mean, I think it's easier to have some function that goes and finds which local objects are in this category of user modifiable and lets you do something with them, it seems to me, than to distinguish, oh, this happens to be a JPEG versus this is a .packlet file and can't be modified. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm leaning towards saying put everything in the local base directory, but I do see the argument to have some things in some kind of more sort of you might modify this type area. But on the other hand, which ones are UUID'd? I mean, do we expect that? Okay, that's a good question. Which things, the externally user modifiable but permanent? The question is, do they have UUID names? Did you get what I'm asking? Because if they do, that's not very user modifiable. It's kind of a mess, right? So if they don't have UUID names, that means that it is something like a dynamic image, which actually references a known file. See what I'm saying?
Right. Well, I mean, they currently have UUID names because you insist that they have UUID names. But people want to capture audio for the sake of capturing audio. They don't necessarily think of it as, a language construct, or they might also want it, just the MP3 itself. And not.
Okay, but I think this is a different case. I think if you're using our user interface to capture something that is being stored in a file for you, you can say where you want it stored, and you can give it a name, and you're all happy. But that's not the default action. And if after the fact you say, oh, that audio that I captured, I don't want to use export to deal with it. I want to find the raw file. I'm just not that interested in that case. If you know beforehand, I'm capturing this for the sake of putting it in a file, great, give the name of the file. But if you didn't say the name of the file, you've got to UUID it anyway. So under those circumstances, I don't understand why it's not going into the local object store. I mean, if you give the name of a file, then I think the user base directory is the right place to put it, or user's document directory, rather. If you give the name of a file yourself, but if you don't give the name of a file and it defaults to a UUID file, I claim that should go into the local object store.
Right.
So does rename a file work to move a local object into an ordinary file so that I can go oops after the fact and not just
I think that we could make that work, yeah, because we should I agree, we could make that work. That seems like a very reasonable thing.
Well, but that's more like export, because local objects have metadata attached to it, so it's not just...
Right, and the other point is, if you do that rename, everything's going to get messed up. In other words, the thing that is pointing to it it's a copy file.
Copy file or export.
Yeah, I mean, the copy file from local objects should probably work.
Yes.
Right, and that's a reasonable solution to that, I think.
Right, although I would claim that there's still benefit in being able to sort of scan these things in the
Not
Finder.
If they have UUIDs.
Sure, you can see what they are, right? You can sort them by date in the Finder. I think
that's file hacking. By the time you're looking at UUIDs,
you're not looking at UUIDs. You're looking at a list of files that gives you little previews, so you can find the one you want.
Okay. Great. Then you can do that in the local object store. You know where it is. You can go look.
Except you can't, because they're not files. They've been turned into hacked up directories.
Okay. So what this is about is the Finder isn't powerful enough to show you a kind of preview of a directory, but it is powerful enough to show you a preview of a file. Is that right?
I suppose that's one way of framing it.
What do the local object stores metadata? What does local object metadata do for you in this setting? Do they do anything for you? Or is it just overhead?
Well, I mean, it's essentially the same as in cloud objects. I mean, they store type information, but of course, if it's just an MP3, then I mean, essentially just a directory that contains one metadata file and an MP3.
Okay. Is the metadata useful? Do we actually need the metadata in the local object store?
Well, to manipulate the local objects from within the language, yes. But
why? Why?
Well, it's the only way that when you access it, that you actually know what the format is, whether it's an MP3.
But doesn't it have a file extension?
Well, that is not reliable. I mean, you can export. Because local object names do not have file extensions. They can be anything. So it's only the last component that would have that particular name, but it's just not reliable, just the same as a cloud object. I mean, you really need to.
Why don't we provide a utility in the function repository, for example, that lets you explore the local object store? I personally, what I'm hearing from this, I take the argument, I understand Itai's arguments, I think the following is what we should do. I think we should default to putting things in the local object store. I think if you actually name a file, it should default to go into the user documents directory. And I think that we should indicate on a notebook that it contains assets that are not locally stored in the notebook, and gives you the option to either store them or store them in the cloud and rejigger, because what you might want to do is you might want to say, okay, this notebook, I'm putting it into storage. Now I want to publish these things to the cloud and then have this notebook refer to those things in the cloud. So I think this is where, I mean, you guys should think about it some more, but that's where I'm coming out on this story.
Okay. And Stephen, I just want to point out, if you scroll down just a tiny bit in the agenda, where I showed the structure of a local object. So you see the actual WAV file is called uuid/export, and then there's uuid/object.wl, which is the metadata.
Why is this not called .wave? Why does that not have a file extension, guys?
Okay, I mean
that's a question for Shadi or maybe Piotr.
No, it's a question for Roman.
More question for me. I mean, because I have the metadata, I don't really care about the name of the.
I think you should add a file extension, because that way it gives the file system a fighting chance. And
right, there's no way.
I have to recheck the code. I mean, I'm not sure whether that part, because some of these export formats were written by others, because the system is. But I can check and see how much. I mean, generally, I do not like the idea of people mousing around these directories, because it's so easy to make things inconsistent. Like if you delete or modify the.
Right, but I think we should be at least civilized and call that metadata.wl or something like this. But whatever.
Okay, I can look into the file name extension, see why.
Because then it gives it a fighting chance to. I mean, it might have a magic number in the file or something that would allow it to preview anyway. I don't know whether it uses magic numbers. Does it use
I can check into this.
I think most modern file browsers are really just go by extensions.
No, actually not. I mean, certainly not in Linux. It's quite the opposite, I think. They go by magic numbers and stuff like that.
Maybe. Okay.
I mean, macOS will completely punt on text files that don't have a text extension.
Yeah, I've seen that. That's really
yeah.
Annoying. Yes. Okay, but I mean, again, then we're diving deep into the jungle of different operating systems and how they behave.
Right.
But I think that having some higher degree of civilization to give the operating system a fighting chance is worthwhile. I have a comment from Ben on our live stream, which I'm trying to understand. Being able to maintain live data sets in a notebook without having to reevaluate or dump save would be a huge asset, even if it wasn't the default. What does that mean?
I'm sorry, can you read that again?
Being able to maintain, quotes, live data sets in a notebook without having to reevaluate or dump save would be a huge asset. So I see. In other words, having large amounts of data that were automatically included with the notebook, which is exactly what you're getting now. If you press the button in the audio capture thing that says store it locally in the notebook, then it is storing it literally in the notebook, right, Shadi and John?
Yeah.
Even if that makes your notebook 100 megabytes.
Right.
John?
And of course, Iconize is the generalization of this.
Yes. But I mean, out of core Iconize is potentially the future of Iconize, so to speak. Or out of notebook Iconize, so to speak. Where what's there is actually stored in the cloud and is downloaded to some local object store when, I can completely imagine an Iconize, a cloud Iconize, so to speak.
Right. Well, we have a method, right? So which allows you to, compress it or binary serialize it before you stick it in the notebook. So we could certainly conceive of a method goes to cloud object or something.
Yes.
Yes.
But I really quite like that idea. I think that would be quite useful to people to, you cloud publish the thing, because the whole point is we have a new assumption, which is that everybody can reach anything you've cloud published. Now, of course, it might not be true. You might be, air gapped in some, strange location.
You might be spending 28 hours in an airport waiting to take off, like my return from Brazil, but...
Yeah, right. Well, be glad there's some airports that are even in worse shape. Okay.
Let's at least try to get the store now for data set, since we have Chris Carlson and design folk here.
Wait, what are we talking about?
I thought we've wrapped up on.
We have wrapped this up.
Okay, so
Where
then
is the store
I'm
now?
suggesting
Okay.
skip the next 2 items and go to the yes.
There was one other thing, and that
Okay.
we wanted to propose this kind of a target location or target directory, that instead of storing things in the user documents directory, which is my user shoddy documents, we can specify some other location. If I specify a file name for that audio capture.
Sure. Wait. You're specifying a file name. What you want to do is specify the default path, right?
Exactly.
Well, why didn't you call it path? Why isn't that option just path? Oh no, that's a bad idea.
Yeah.
Don't we
because
have
of-
other cases where we're specifying a default directory for things?
I don't think we do. I mean, I can't think of one off the top of my head.
Why wouldn't you just specify the directory name here? Why is it that you want an option name?
Because
Then you can set option,
Oh, I
at
hate
least
doing
as one of the useful
Yeah.
things.
Because generally the way we've done that is to have a variable, but I agree that it's kind of ugly to have that in every function.
And I mean, it's not only a directory. It could be a local base. It could be a cloud base. It could be.
I mean, it could be colon greater than a local base, for example.
Sure.
No, I mean the location where you store it need not be a directory. It could be a local.
Is it a
object.
persistence location?
Yes, something like that. Anything.
Well, so
where
can
you
persistence location take an actual file path?
But I think that I think the point is, if we make the default location, local objects, but I want them to go by default, all my UUID guys to go into my user documents directory, I can just set this option.
No, I understand that. I'm saying, why can't you use as the option persistence location? Doesn't persistence location already do this?
I see.
But that's not general enough. I mean, that's
right.
But a different concept. I mean,
yeah, that's a very different context. I don't. Think
we need to think this through. But that just my main concern was the name, the term directory in the name of that option. And so target location is actually not that bad.
Well, what is the analogous thing in the persistence world?
Well, it would be a persistent. It would be.
Right, except I don't think it's a persistent thing, right?
It would be something that ends in a slash, so that it would be just like a directory. But persistence locations themselves are like root directories.
I think this is very similar to persistence. I think it's very much the same idea. And I recommend thinking.
But I don't. Well, first of all, it's not persistence path, right? Because persistence path is like path; it's where to look for things.
Persistence
Fair
base.
So it might be persistence location, but I think
no,
that
Roman is saying it's like persistence base, which also has a form of. There isn't a persistence base without a dollar.
That's no, I'm not sure.
I would think that was an option, but maybe it isn't. Maybe it's an argument.
I think it might be an option. I don't remember at the moment.
Well, it is not listed as an option here, so if it is an option, that's a bug.
Right, and it looks like persistence location is a head, not an option name.
Right.
So
I'm saying I think this should be somehow related to persistence base, and it requires further thought.
Okay.
Well, yeah, related, but I just remembered the main difference is, of course, that inside these persistence locations, you only store persistent objects, which are these things with metadata and everything. So it's not suitable for specifying a local directory for a naked file.
Okay, fine. Ethan on our live stream is pointing out that organized access to local objects for a given notebook is more helpful than a giant store. Yeah, I understand, but I mean, there's sort of a choice because it's either global or it's not global, and there are places where you might want to share. You have two notebooks, you're working on an audio, processing, task, and you share them between notebooks, and then you don't want to copy the file. So I agree with you that being able to get what are the local objects associated with a given notebook, that will be a useful thing to be able to get. So it would be something like notebook local objects or something, would give you the local objects associated with the current notebook. Or it could be a current value of the notebook or something. We really need to wrap this meeting because I have another meeting and then we have another live stream for people who are paying attention to this.
Right. So So I think let's just look at the mock-ups. But these were sort of this may or may not actually be implemented in the prototype build. But these were sort of our two. I am partial to sticking the scroll bar at the very top, so the horizontal scroll bar at the top, so that it meets the vertical.
What's wrong with this? Integrating the button into the data set?
Well, what if it's a very narrow
sometimes the data set is very narrow.
I see.
Right, like if you did, if you instead of
So Chris, if the data set isn't sufficiently wide that you need to scroll it, is it the case that the scroller will be absent?
Yes.
I mean, I admit that I'm not that unpartial to having the scroller at the top because that's typically where the column labels are, and you're typically looking at the column labels when you're scrolling.
Yeah.
Rather than at the bottom where, who knows what you're looking at.
Yeah, another issue at the bottom currently is that when you scroll, the content size may change and it causes you to lose tracking on the scroll bar. There may be a way to work around that, but it doesn't currently work. If it's at the top, that problem goes away.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's okay to do that. I mean, Billy is here also, right? So the fact that there's a gutter between the scroll bar and the content area is to me not obviously correct.
Well, there's a technical issue there. So if you integrate the scroll bar in the frame, then presumably you want the scroll bar to fill the entire frame. And since the content size will change, if you regenerate it, you lose tracking on the scroll bar. And that may be the reason that it was originally done this way.
There is a framed version, but I think that there's some additional technical issues with it. So if you scroll down to number 3, yeah, there is.
Right, he put a frame around the whole thing.
I mean, there's no problem with putting a loose frame around it, as long as you don't expect the scroll bars, to fill the frame. That's
like this. I think this is good. I think this looks a lot better. This thing just looks like it's got little pieces hanging out that are bugs.
Right.
I like this. I think this with the scroll bar at the top would be just fine. And in the case where so the only issue is the sort of the zero case where there aren't any scroll bars. But then do you have the outer frame? How does the outer frame come in when scroll bars start sprouting? Do you get what I'm asking?
Yeah. Well, if there were no scroll bars at all, then you would just get the naked thing like you do now.
No, I understand that, but you're going to double frame it. As soon as there's a scroll bar, that means you're double framing as soon as there's a scroll bar.
I mean, it seems to me like for consistency, you would want to double frame it always.
I think that's not going to look sensible. Billy, do you have a comment on that?
I mean, are there other header options that's going to go to the top? I think you said there were.
Well, depending on your data set, there can be a header at the top, but it's a part of the grid.
I think the double frame would look fine if there was, if it wasn't all white between the frames.
You mean if it were like a panel?
If it were more panel, sort of a little bit more manipulate-like.
Yeah,
I think we can get the scroll bars looking a little bit more like scroll bars instead of impacting the frame style, because we have like information and other things which sort of follow this lightweight kind of boxed approach, which I think we could just, we could still keep and then just put a little bit different stylizing on the scroll bars.
Look, I think something like this is going to work. This thing saying data not a notebook store now is not very consistent with what you're seeing here, right?
It's consistent with like sparse array.
Okay, well, somebody, Devin, I think needs to go in and chase how these it isn't stored store now stuff works, because I think they're not consistent.
But this store now is the completely standard for this type of not stored.
All right, okay.
The audio object basically says that the file that this audio was linking to is missing. It doesn't say this is out of core.
Oh, that particular one says it's missing, right? But if it was there, you would have a Store Now button.
Right. We won't now, but we could.
Right. We need that. And my point is that has to be consistent in look with what we have here.
But I mean, we already have these for summary boxes, right? If you do sparse array of range.
I understand. Okay, I really need to go. And for people who are, can somebody let the yeah, fine. That's the fine thing. That's what we need. That's the same thing we need for the audio objects, right?
Right. Well, it's
okay.
Right. It's a slightly different issue, but
how about two-finger scrolling? Oh, that's a good question. How two-finger scrolling works in the data sets. And Chris, you need to make that work correctly.
You mean when you're scrolling, you're mousing down in the dataset content?
Yes. Yes. That you not have to go, mouseably, that you can do trackpad scrolling inside there.
Right.
That's a detailed UI thing. Okay, listen, I gotta run.
Okay. But I think we have enough to make.
Yeah, we actually made some progress eventually. So those who are interested in the live stream about predicate logic, will be there in about 10 minutes. Okay, see you all soon.